Private Tokishi Yamada pressed the razor blade against his wrist. It was July 28, 1944, 3 days after his capture on Saipan, and he'd already decided. It was better to die by his own hand than face what the Americans would do to him. His officers had been clear about that. Torture first, then execution. Maybe they'd send his body parts back to Japan as a warning. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't even eat the rice ball they'd given him. Every time a guard walked past his holding cell, he flinched, waiting for it to begin. But something was wrong. The Americans kept feeding him. They'd bandaged his wounds. A medic had given him water, clean water, and checked his temperature like he mattered. Yamada stared at the blade, confused. They were supposed to hate him. His unit had fought to the last man. He'd fired on American soldiers until his rifle jammed and shrapnel tore through his leg. He was the enemy. So why were they keeping him alive? The razor blade trembled in his hand. Nothing made sense anymore. Nothing at all. The Imperial Japanese Army had one rule about surrender, and every soldier knew it by heart. The Senjinkan Battlefield Code, issued in January 1941, was clear as daylight. Never suffer the shame of becoming a prisoner. It was death before dishonor. If you were captured alive, you ceased to exist. Your name would be struck from family records. Your ancestors would turn away in disgust. The Emperor himself would forget you ever served. Yamada had memorized those words during basic training. He'd watched officers explain what happened to men weak enough to surrender. The Americans torture prisoners, they said. They'll pull out your fingernails for information, then shoot you in a ditch when they're done. They're barbarians who don't follow any rules. Better to save the last bullet for yourself. Better to charge their lines and die with honor. Some men on Saipan had chosen the cliffs instead, jumping hundreds of feet onto the rocks below rather than face capture. Yamada had seen them fall. He'd understood why. But he'd been unconscious when they found him, bleeding into the dirt with shrapnel in his leg and no strength left to resist. He woke up on a stretcher, American voices around him, and the shame hit him like a physical weight. He was already dead. His mother would receive notice that he died honorably in battle, because the truth that he'd been captured was too shameful to admit. Japan didn't even acknowledge that POWs existed. As far as his government was concerned, he'd simply vanished. The propaganda had been everywhere. Leaflets showed skeletal prisoners in cages, Americans standing over them with clubs. Cartoons depicted enemy soldiers as demons with fangs. The message was always the same. They will make you suffer, and then they will kill you slowly. So when the American medic crouched beside him that first day, Yamada had closed his eyes and waited for the pain to start. The medic said something in English, incomprehensible, and Yamada felt hands on his wounded leg. He tensed, expecting the wound to be made worse, a punishment for surviving. Instead, the medic cleaned it. Applied sulfur powder. Wrapped it in clean bandages. Gave him a shot of something that made the pain fade to a dull throb. Then the medic moved on to the next wounded prisoner, Japanese like him, and did the same thing. Yamada opened his eyes and stared at the tent ceiling. This wasn't torture. This was medicine. Professional, efficient medicine that treated him like a patient, not an animal. One of the other prisoners, an older man with a chest wound, whispered the question they were all thinking. Why are they wasting medicine on dead men? Nobody had an answer. They'd been trained for brutality and received care instead. The transport ship came 3 days later, and during the entire voyage to San Diego, not a single American guard raised a hand against them. The beatings they'd been promised never came. The torture never started. Yamada kept the razor blade hidden in his jacket, just in case. But with each passing day, he used it less and less. Before we continue, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Hit that like button too, because your engagement helps these forgotten stories reach people who need to hear them. We're building the most complete archive of untold World War II stories on YouTube, one forgotten hero at a time. Now back to Yamada's story. The numbers told their own story. By the end of the war, America would hold 378,156 German prisoners and 50,273 Italians on its soil. But Japanese POWs? Only 5,424. Not because Americans weren't capturing Japanese soldiers, but because most chose death instead. The fight to the last man mentality wasn't propaganda, it was doctrine, and it worked exactly as intended. Entire garrisons committed suicide rather than surrender. On Saipan alone, thousands of civilians and soldiers threw themselves off cliffs. The Japanese military culture had turned capture into something worse than death itself. But America had made a calculated decision. Despite Japan refusing to ratify the Geneva Convention, despite Japanese forces torturing and executing American POWs in the Pacific, the United States would follow the rules anyway. Not out of naive idealism, but cold strategic thinking. Treat prisoners well and they talk freely, providing intelligence that saves American lives in the next battle. Document the treatment and use it as propaganda to encourage more surrenders. Show the world that democratic values hold even under pressure. Maybe, just maybe, Japan would reciprocate and treat captured Americans better. They didn't, but the policy held firm regardless. Yamada would eventually end up at Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, one of several facilities holding Japanese POWs. Others were Camp Clarinda in Iowa, Camp Livingston in Louisiana, Fort Hunt in Virginia, and Camp Tracy in California. These camps were more isolated than the ones holding Germans or Italians because American public hatred toward the Japanese ran deeper and hotter. But inside the wire, the policy was consistent. Buddhist shrines were built. Japanese-speaking liaisons, often second-generation Americans whose own families were in internment camps, facilitated communication. Red Cross inspectors documented everything. Food rations matched what American soldiers received, sometimes better than what Japanese troops had eaten during the war. America was treating an enemy that had shown no mercy to its own soldiers with dignity anyway. It wasn't charity. It was civilization chosen deliberately when vengeance would have been easier and more satisfying. The Camp McCoy in Wisconsin hit Yamada like a wall of heat. It was August 1944, and after months in the tropical hell of Saipan, the humid Midwestern summer felt like stepping into a different world. The processing took hours. Medical screenings, delousing stations, tuberculosis tests. They were thorough, clinical, completely impersonal. Yamada was assigned to Barrack 7, given a thin mattress and a wool blanket, and then marched to the mess hall with 30 other prisoners. He stared at the tray in his hands and couldn't process what he was seeing. Meatloaf. Mashed potatoes swimming in gravy. Green beans. Bread with a pat of butter. Apple pie. Coffee. Milk. More food on one metal tray than he'd seen in his entire military service. In the Japanese army, rations meant a handful of rice if you were lucky, watery soup if you weren't, and sometimes nothing at all for days. On Saipan, they'd eaten grass, chewed on bugs, gnawed leather straps. Yamada had weighed 145 pounds when the war started. At capture, he was 98. Some men refused to touch the food. It had to be poisoned, they whispered. This was the test before the execution. Others ate slowly, methodically, tears streaming down their faces without sound. One prisoner ate too fast and vomited onto the floor. The guards didn't laugh or punish him. They just brought a mop and more food. A guard named Corporal Miller approached Yamada's table. He picked up the butter knife, spread butter on a piece of bread, took a bite, then handed the knife to Yamada. The message was clear. Not poisoned. Yamada spread the butter with shaking hands. The richness hit his tongue, the salt, the fat his starving body screamed for. He started crying and couldn't stop. Shame and relief crashed together in his chest. He was supposed to be dead. Instead he was tasting butter. They allowed seconds, then thirds. That evening, men sat on their bunks holding their stomachs, trying to understand what had happened. If they fed condemned men this well, what were they? By September, Camp McCoy had settled into routine. Morning roll call, work assignments, structured days that felt almost normal. The liaisons were Nisei, second-generation Japanese Americans who spoke both languages fluently. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. These men translated for enemy prisoners while their own families sat in internment camps scattered across the American West. But they did their jobs professionally, without bitterness that showed. Yamada was assigned to a dairy farm 12 miles from camp. The farmer, Jack Peterson, was a World War I veteran missing 2 fingers on his left hand. His approach was simple and direct. You work honest, I treat you honest. He taught Yamada how to operate American farm equipment, how to fix a fence properly, how to handle dairy cows without spooking them. Competence mattered here, and Yamada felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Pride. On heavy work days, Peterson left sandwiches and lemonade by the barn. His wife never spoke to the prisoners, but her pies appeared on the fence post every Thursday like clockwork. Back at camp, the guards organized baseball games. POWs against guards, teaching them America's national pastime. The absurdity was staggering. Playing catch with men you tried to kill months ago. But Yamada discovered he was good at it, and for a few hours each week, the war felt smaller. The camp had a library stocked with Japanese books, classical literature, and language primers. A Buddhist shrine was built with official approval. Male privileges were granted, heavily censored but real. Yamada wrote home knowing the letter might never arrive. I am alive. I am fed. I work on a farm. Simple facts, nothing more. The psychological shift was happening whether he wanted it or not. From I am dead to I am human again. When malaria struck him in October, the camp doctor treated him with quinine and careful monitoring. No distinction between prisoners and guards, just patients who needed care. In Japan, sick soldiers were abandoned to die. Here, they gave him medicine and checked on him twice daily. December 1944 brought the first Christmas in captivity. The U.S. Army organized a celebration for all prisoners, decorating the mess hall with paper chains and pine branches. Carols played in English over loudspeakers. Then came the feast. Roast turkey with stuffing, cranberry sauce, sweet potatoes glazed with brown sugar, fresh rolls, and 3 different kinds of pie. Yamada stared at his plate, trying to comprehend the abundance. More food than he'd seen in his entire life, presented as if it were normal, as if feeding enemy prisoners like honored guests was something America did without thinking. Then the guards started distributing bottles. Green glass, ice cold, condensation beading on the surface. Yamada read the white script. Coca-Cola. He'd heard about it in propaganda lectures back in Japan, held up as proof of American decadence and waste. He twisted off the cap and the fizz escaped with a sharp hiss. The smell hit him first, sweet and strange. He took a sip. The carbonation, the sugar rush, the cold shocked his system. He froze, just froze, holding the bottle and trying to process what he was tasting. Around him, other prisoners were laughing. Some were crying. Others sat in stunned disbelief, asking each other if Americans really gave this to their own soldiers. A young guard, maybe 19 years old, demonstrated through exaggerated gestures. You drink it fast, like this. Yamada drank and coughed from the carbonation, then started laughing despite himself. It was ridiculous. They were laughing at Coca-Cola. Someone produced a harmonica. Japanese songs filled the hall, then American ones, then comfortable silence. The young guard approached with a translator. "Merry Christmas," he said. Yamada tried the English words himself to no avail. That night, lying in his bunk, the calculation in his head shifted. They were enemy combatants. Americans had every reason to hate them. And yet, turkey and Coca-Cola. If this was how they treated defeated enemies, what else had the Empire lied about? By March 1945, male privileges expanded. The Red Cross facilitated communication through neutral Switzerland, and Yamada wrote his letter with careful precision, knowing multiple governments would read every word. I am a prisoner in America. I am alive. I am fed better than as a soldier. The Americans follow international law. Do not believe what you hear about torture. Simple facts that contradicted everything Japan had promised about captivity. The letter reached his mother in Hiroshima 2 months later. She read it 3 times, then made a dangerous choice. She shared it with neighbors despite the risk of military police attention. Other families were receiving similar letters from sons everyone assumed were dead. The propaganda wall was cracking, one envelope at a time. Japanese civilians whispered questions they'd never dared ask before. If they're alive and fed, what else were we told that wasn't true? Camp McCoy started offering voluntary education classes. Democracy, American history, concepts that sounded alien to Yamada's ears. The idea that government served the people instead of the other way around seemed backwards, almost childish. But then he watched it play out in real time. An American guard lost his temper and shoved a prisoner during work detail. The camp commandant disciplined him publicly at evening roll call with 5 words. Standards apply to everyone. In the Japanese army, that guard would have been praised for maintaining discipline. Here, he was punished for losing control. Spring brought worse news. Okinawa falling. Tokyo firebombed into ash. The empire collapsing under its own weight. Some prisoners remained fiercely loyal, refusing to accept reality. Others despaired quietly, processing the magnitude of defeat. Yamada felt torn between relief at being alive, shame at surrendering, and a growing confusion about his own identity. Am I still Japanese? Am I still a soldier? What am I now? The questions had no easy answers, but they demanded to be asked anyway. Japanese POWs became America's most valuable intelligence asset, and the reason was cultural. Surrendered soldiers believed they'd lost all honor and ceased to exist in the eyes of their nation. Nothing left to lose meant nothing left to protect. Specialized facilities like Fort Hunt in Virginia and Camp Tracy in California handled high-value prisoners with a consistent approach. Respectful conversation, not torture. High-quality food, comfortable quarters, cultural sensitivity. Japanese-speaking interrogators, often Nisei Americans, conducted interviews that felt more like discussions than interrogations. Yamada was transferred to Fort Hunt in April 1945. They asked about Saipan's defensive positions, unit strength, supply routes, troop morale. He answered every question freely and in detail. I am already dead to Japan. Why should I protect them? The information he provided, combined with intelligence from other cooperative POWs, saved American lives in subsequent Pacific operations. Some prisoners were eager to help, believing the war was unjust and wanting it to end faster. Others felt conflicted, justifying their cooperation as pragmatic survival while wrestling with what it meant. The intelligence gathered was extraordinary. There were detailed maps sketched from memory. Tactical doctrine explained, weapon capabilities were documented, and they received information about kamikaze tactics, submarine deployments, command structure, decision-making processes, morale factors amongst all other intelligence goldmines. German and Italian POWs had been far less forthcoming, but Japanese prisoners talked willingly once they accepted they'd already died in the eyes of their homeland. American intelligence officers were surprised by the cooperation level, though they shouldn't have been. Respectful treatment was paying strategic dividends exactly as intended. Yamada felt the complexity of it. Useful again, contributing something meaningful, but at what cost? He was helping Americans kill Japanese soldiers, men who believed what he'd once believed. The ethical weight sat heavy on his shoulders, but he kept talking anyway. If he couldn't be an honorable soldier anymore, at least he could help end the war faster and save lives on both sides. August 6, 1945. News filtered into Camp McCoy slowly, and the American guards weren't celebrating. They moved through the compound with somber faces, unusually quiet. The translator finally gathered the prisoners and explained in careful Japanese. Atomic bomb. Hiroshima. Yamada's world stopped. Hiroshima was his home. His mother, his 2 sisters, his neighborhood, the temple where his father was buried. Everything he'd left behind. For 3 days, no information came about survivors. The camp doctor found him sitting alone outside the barracks and offered extra rations with quiet sympathy. I'm sorry about your city. August 9th brought news of Nagasaki. By August 15th, the Emperor's surrender broadcast. POWs were allowed to hear it, the voice they'd never heard in their lives. Emperor Hirohito announcing defeat in formal court language that made the horror feel distant and unreal. Some prisoners wept openly. Others sat in relieved silence. Some showed nothing at all. Yamada felt numb. His nation had surrendered. His city was possibly ash. He was alive in Wisconsin, well-fed and safe, while his family faced hell. September brought confirmation through Red Cross channels. His mother survived. One sister died in the blast. Their home had vaporized. The survivors' guilt crashed down like physical weight. American guards offered condolences and medical support for the depression that followed. We didn't want this. We just wanted the war to end. Repatriation moved slowly through 1946. Logistics, vetting, transportation across a shattered Pacific. Some POWs volunteered to stay temporarily, saying there was nothing left to return to. Yamada boarded a transport ship in April 1946 and arrived at Yokohama to find his country in ruins. The train to Hiroshima took him through devastation that stretched for miles. The city itself was unrecognizable, flattened to rubble and ash. He found his mother in a makeshift shelter, thin and aged beyond her years. She looked at him with a mixture of joy and pain that needed no words. "You survived. They fed you." He told her about America, about the food and treatment and baseball games that made no sense in the middle of war. She listened to everything, then placed her hand on his. "They showed you mercy. Remember that." Yamada rebuilt his life in devastated Hiroshima one day at a time. He cleared rubble, helped construct temporary shelters, worked alongside other survivors trying to resurrect a city from ash. He kept one thing from America, a baseball the guards had given him as a farewell gift. It sat on the shelf in his small room, scuffed and faded, a sign of a different world that had existed beyond the war. In 1947, he began writing a memoir that would never be published but would be kept and reread for decades. He detailed everything. The food, the treatment, the confusion of being treated humanely by an enemy he'd been taught to fear. "I went to America expecting to die. I came home questioning everything." His mother read it and placed her hand on the pages. "Tell this story. People need to know." By the 1950s, Yamada had become a teacher. He told students about his POW experience, not to glorify America, but to demonstrate a harder truth. Civilization is a choice. When the Americans had every reason to hate us, they chose restraint instead. The lesson wasn't about heroes or villains. It was about what's possible when humanity survives hatred. Here's what this story teaches us that history books often miss. Civilization isn't measured by how you treat friends or allies. It's measured by what you do when your enemy is helpless and no one would blame you for revenge. America in 1944 had every justification for brutality. Pearl Harbor, Bataan Death March, thousands of American POWs tortured and executed in Japanese camps. Public rage against Japan was at its peak. Yet the official policy remained humane treatment, not because Japanese soldiers deserved it, but because America chose to remain who they were even under pressure. The strategic benefits were real. Intelligence gathered from cooperative POWs saved American lives. Propaganda about good treatment encouraged surrenders. But beneath the strategy was a moral framework that refused to abandon civilized standards even when facing an enemy that had abandoned them first. That's not weakness. That's strength of a kind that's harder to maintain than vengeance. Yamada carried that lesson back to Japan, and he wasn't alone. Thousands of POWs returned home with similar stories, and those stories quietly shaped post-war Japanese society's understanding of what America represented. Not perfection, but possibility. Not saints, but people who chose restraint when revenge was easier. The seeds planted in POW camps, in mess halls serving Coca-Cola to starving men, in farmers handing tractor keys to enemy soldiers, grew into the US-Japan alliance that has lasted 80 years. That's the long game of civilization. That's what mercy looks like when it's allowed to bloom across generations. If this story moved you, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. These stories of restraint and humanity are seldom told, but they matter. Your engagement helps push content like this to people who can learn from it. We're building the most complete archive of untold World War II stories on YouTube, and every share helps these lessons reach further. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.